The entire steel mill had ground to a halt, not a slow, grinding cessation of work, but an abrupt, dead stop. The afternoon shift had arrived to find the mill's main artery, the central rail line, completely choked by a silent, 2-mile-long metal serpent. This train, laden with thousands of tons of steel and raw materials, was blocking the bridge over the river, severing the two halves of the sprawling complex. It was cutting off a half-dozen access roads, trapping vehicles and preventing crucial movements between plants. Foremen were screaming into phones, executives were storming out of their offices, and the mighty roar of production had been replaced by a chorus of confused and angry shouts. They wanted to know who was responsible, and the answer they got was simple. Frank, my grandfather-in-law. And Frank was at home, eating his dinner. To understand how a single man with a lunch pail could bring a titan of industry to its knees, you have to go back to the 1960s, and back even further, to the man Frank was. Frank wasn't the kind of man who made a lot of noise. He was forged in the fires of the Second World War. He'd been a soldier, a prisoner of war in Italy, and he didn't talk about it much. But the story was that he hadn't waited to be liberated. He got himself out of that POW camp, found his way back to his unit, picked up his rifle, and got right back to the business of fighting a war. So, when I say he was a verified badass, I'm not exaggerating. He was a man of quiet resolve, immense principle, and zero tolerance for foolishness. After the war, he came home and got a job at the local steel mill, working the railroad. It wasn't the mainline railroad, but the mill's own internal system. He was the guy who moved the massive train cars around the complex, a sprawling industrial city that sat on both sides of a wide river. His job was the circulatory system of the place. He'd pick up cars loaded with coal and iron ore from one end and haul them to the blast furnaces. He'd move ladles of molten steel that glowed with the heat of the sun. He'd position finished coils of steel, each weighing as much. One day, a memo came down from the clean, quiet offices far removed from the grit and heat of the mill floor. Some new executive, a man with a fresh business degree and a sharp suit, had looked at a spreadsheet and seen a line item called overtime. And he decided that line item needed to be 0. The new rule was simple, absolute, and profoundly stupid. No overtime. No exceptions. The foremen, men who had worked the floor for decades, just shook their heads. They knew it was impossible. But the order came from on high. It was the new gospel. Frank read the memo on the bulletin board, his face impassive. He didn't complain. He didn't argue with his supervisor. He just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around his jaw, the only sign of his thoughts. For the first week, he did his best to comply. He'd cut runs short, leaving cars in awkward spots to make sure he was back at the time clock by 3 p.m. sharp. It caused little hiccups in production, minor delays that probably annoyed the afternoon shift, but it wasn't enough to get the attention of the men in the suits. All they saw was that overtime costs were down, and they no doubt congratulated themselves on their brilliant management. Frank understood something they didn't. He understood that some rules are so idiotic, the only way to prove their idiocy is to follow them. Perfectly. To the letter. He saw that shouting would do no good. An argument would be dismissed. The only language these executives would understand was the sound of a silent factory. So he started watching. He started planning. He wasn't just doing his job anymore. He was a strategist, waiting for the perfect conditions. He needed a specific type of train, not just long, but impossibly long. And he needed it at a specific time, late in his shift. He watched the schedules. He monitored the flow of materials, biding his time. It took him a couple of weeks to get it just right, for all the pieces to align into a perfect storm of malicious compliance. Then, the day came. He walked into work that morning, same as any other day. He got his assignment, and a slow, knowing smile must have crept across his face. It was the one. The perfect. Then came the centerpiece of his plan, the bridge. He eased the engine onto the bridge spanning the river, the water churning below. The clack, clack, clack of the wheels on the rails was a steady countdown. He pulled the train across, slowly, methodically, until the engine was on the other side, and the middle of his 2-mile behemoth was sitting squarely on the only rail link between the two halves of the entire operation. He kept going, watching the clock on the dashboard. 2:50, 2:55. He was positioning the engine now, inching it forward. The cab of his locomotive was getting closer and closer to the small shed that housed the time clock. 2:58. 2:59. The end of his train was still deep in the other section of the mill, across the river. The body of the train was blocking everything. At precisely 3 p.m., the shift change whistle blew its shrill cry across the mill. Frank pulled the brake. The train hissed and shuddered to a complete stop. He methodically went through his shutdown procedure, flicking switches and turning knobs until the big diesel engine fell silent. He grabbed his metal lunch pail, swung himself down from the cab, and landed with a soft thud on the gravel. He didn't look back at the chaos he had just engineered. He simply walked the 20 feet to the time clock shed, took his card from the rack, and slid it into the machine. Ka-chunk. He clocked out, hung his card back up, and walked to his car in the employee lot. As he drove out the main gate, he could already hear the first confused shouts in the distance. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The afternoon shift engineer arrived to find the engine parked and cold, with no way to move it and a 2-mile train attached to it that was paralyzing the entire facility. Nothing could cross the river. Raw materials couldn't get to the furnaces. Finished steel couldn't get to the shipping yards. Every minute the train sat there, the company was losing thousands of dollars. The bosses went nuclear. They tracked down Frank's home phone number. His wife, my grandmother-in-law, answered. "I need to speak to Frank!" a frantic manager yelled into the phone. She calmly... "Frank's shift ends at 3 p.m., the rep continued, cutting him off. "He stopped his engine, secured it, and clocked out at 3 p.m. He did not work a single second of overtime. He followed your exact rule. You want to punish a man for doing precisely what you ordered him to do?" The room went silent. The manager stared, his mouth slightly open. He was caught. There was nothing he could do, nothing he could say. Frank had followed their stupid rule with such surgical precision that he had turned it into a weapon against them. The union shut down any talk of punishment right then and there. Frank was cleared of any wrongdoing. He walked out of that office and went right back to work. And when he got to the bulletin board, he saw a new memo had already been posted. It was a hastily typed revision to the overtime policy. The "no exceptions" clause had mysteriously vanished. Frank became a quiet legend on the mill floor. The story of the day he parked the train was told for years, a cautionary tale for new bosses, and a source of pride for the guys on the line. He never bragged about it. He never even brought it up. He didn't have to. He had proven his point in the most undeniable way possible. He had taught a powerful company a very expensive lesson about the difference between rules on a spreadsheet and the reality of the work done by the men who get their hands dirty. The badass POW had shown them that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a rifle, but a rule book, followed with absolute, glorious, and devastating obedience.